Conundrum this week as I considered Elijah encountering the still small voice of God in silence, and I wondered, how do I preach a sermon on silence? So, as we, beloved worshiping community, remember Jesus continuing his journey towards the cross on Good Friday, we continue our exploration of spiritual practices that are designed to bring us closer to Jesus. 2 weeks ago, we looked at the Lord's Prayer and Psalm 23 as daily drivers' prayers. And last week, if you recall, we examined pray always, pray everywhere, pray with everything, or as Paul says, pray continually, and how to do that. But this morning, I would like to explore with you the spiritual practice of finding God in the silence, as Elijah discovered. I recently saw the movie Top Gun Maverick, and there was a scene in there at the beginning of the movie where there was an experimental aircraft that was attempting to break Mach 10 for the first time. And in the movie, as the pilot is approaching Mach 10, we see a dial with red numbers, and the numbers are going up and up and up, and then we see the dial combined with the sonic textures of jet engines shaking in the cockpit, the jet stream rushing across the wings, and the pilot's rapid breathing. And all of these sounds are jump cut one after the other, rising in a crescendo of sound until the numbers hit Mach 10. And then everything is silent. At the moment of this great achievement, the sound stops, and the scene focuses on the pilot's face in complete and profound silence. And this moment is powerful not because of all the sounds that were very exciting, but because of the silence that we encounter. The silence draws us in to an intimate connection with that pilot's feelings, emotions at that time. Or consider this. If you're talking to someone in a conversation and you find them talking louder and louder and louder, do you find yourself moving further back? But if you're talking to someone and their voice is getting quieter and quieter, does that quietness draw you closer to the person so you can connect better? The small whispering voice of God is inviting us in to intimacy with God. And in that intimacy, please consider that miracles happen when when our humanity meets God's divinity, where we can hear God's still small voice. You see, if we go to the world of music, sometimes the silence between the notes can be as powerful as the notes. Sometimes the silence between the notes is part of the complete idea of the music that's being expressed. It's that silence sometimes that invites people into the connection with the music. So I want to go back 45 years. longer than I would like. 45 years ago, thereabouts, I was a first-year drama teacher in a high school, and I decided, with great craziness and ambition, to present a play called The Enchanted by a French playwright, Jean Giraudoux. And this play was set in a forest, and it was set indoors, and it had these wonderful elements in it. And so we had 6 weeks to do the play, and I started working with the actors, and I started building the sets, except I had no idea what to do. When I was taking that course at my university, it was like a couple hours. So I had no clue what to do with the sets, but I knew what to do with the actors. And 5 days before the show opened, I determined that the actors were doing so beautifully, expressing the play and the emotions of the play and the connections in the play, and the setting that we were making was so horrible that we needed to throw it out. And I told the cast this 5 days before we opened. And the next day I went to the hardware store. We did this in an auditorium, a multipurpose room, I should say. And I took blue paint, and I painted the back wall of the multipurpose room blue. And then by lighting, we were able to make that blue look like moonlight, sunlight, shade. And I had some apple crates at home, wooden apple crates, and I brought them in, painted them black, and with the apple crates, we created furniture and bridges and trees. And with the background, we just had this light changing the color. But what that did was there was a visual silence without clutter. And in that visual silence, the beauty and the poetry of the words and the interactions of the characters in the play came through. I discovered later, by accident, I did this, but I discovered later that that visual silence invited the audience to come into the scene and interact with the actors and see the forest and see the interior rooms. I became fascinated with the idea of silence as being rich ever since that point. And what we have in this text today in 1 Kings 19, 3-13, is that it's the silence after the wind, after the earthquake, after the fire. That silence is where Elijah hears God's voice. Here in the silence is when Elijah started to listen to God's voice. It reminded me of Psalm 46, verse 10. And I'm sure you know this, and you've probably seen this printed on greeting cards or T-shirts. Be still and know that I am God. Be still and know that I am God. God is offering us an opportunity for silence and an opportunity for intimacy. Stillness or silence can be a spiritual prayer practice. It's an acknowledgement of God's presence, and it's a practice that we can do anywhere. And if we do this practice of silence anywhere, we are in a sense creating an opportunity for the holy to come into our lives anywhere. We are creating an opportunity for miracle, and miracles happen when our humanity meets God's divinity, where we can hear God's still small voice. So let me give you some background. Elijah is on the run from Queen Jezebel. Elijah, as God's prophet, happened to put to death a whole bunch of her priests who worshiped the false god Baal. Queen Jezebel did not take that lightly because he killed 450 of her priests. So she sent her army after Elijah to run him down and kill him. That is why he found himself in the woods in the wilderness, on the run, and that's where he had an opportunity to experience God in the silence. Now, 1 Kings 19:12, if you look up that specific verse, 12, and you look at multiple versions, interpretations, you will see such a beauty of poetry interpretation. For instance, one version, God's voice is described as a sound of sheer silence, a still small voice, a gentle breeze, a calm whispering voice, the sound of gentle blowing, the sound of soft stillness. I love that God comes to us in the sound of soft stillness. John of the Cross was a 15th century theologian. He said this most amazing thing, his words, "Silence is God's first language." God's first language. And we often think that God speaks in dramatic events, tragic events, big events. God speaks in weddings or in funerals or in tornadoes or hurricanes. But perhaps more often than we realize, God is speaking to us in silence, which is God's first language. So, how do we experience God in silence? And if you've ever heard the phrase, easier said than done, you can write that down right now. It is extraordinarily hard for us in this world today, in our culture with so many inputs from so many places, to experience God in silence. The Buddhists have a word for this, 2 words. They call this monkey mind. And if you've ever tried to meditate or sit in silence or pray in silence, you know that your mind, after several seconds, at least my mind, wants to jump from one thought to another thought to another thought, like a monkey jumping from branch to branch to branch on a tree. If you want to try this out sometime this week, sit quietly by yourself and try to be silent for 2 minutes without your mind jumping all over. It's very difficult. But it's in God's silence that Elijah discovered that we have an opportunity to experience God's basic character. And here's what Elijah discovered about God's basic character. As he was on the run, God wanted to be active in his life. God sent an angel to feed Elijah twice. Or if we go back even further, when the Israelites were in the desert, God sent them manna to feed them for 40 years. If we come forward into this Lenten season, God sends his son to die on the cross to redeem us. God wants to be active in his life. His basic character is this: I see you, I hear you, and I love you. And that character of God, I see you, I hear you, I love you, that's what Elijah discovered in the silence. In the silence, we are less influenced by the voices that we have in our head. Voices that tell us we should be angry, or we should feel inadequate, or we're not good enough, or so-and-so is wrong, and voices that let God come in and say to us, I see you, I hear you, and most importantly, I love you. And also consider this: when we are no longer looking for God in the dramatic, in the wind and the earthquake and the fire, well, where then do we find God? Well, maybe we find God not in the dramatic, but in the ordinary. most of us are going to live lives that are ordinary. Air quotes, okay? Lives that are filled with the ordinary. For instance, we can hear God's voice, God's presence in the ordinary, in the smile of a child, in a trip to the grocery store, very ordinary, in a text message, or being able to hold hands with a loved one, or the laughter of a grandchild, or perhaps in the ordinariness of being in a hospital and confronting our mortality. That's terrible, but it's also a part of our ordinary lives. God is present in the ordinary, in the joy and sorrow, and we understand this, we discover this, we take joy in this when we see that God's still small voice is always present in our lives. And when we can do this, then the ordinary, air quotes, becomes extraordinary. Every part of our lives becomes holy because every part of our lives becomes filled with our awareness of God's presence. I see you. I hear you. I love you. And this is a miracle when we can do this. Miracles happen when our humanity meets God's divinity, where we can hear God's still small voice. There is a pastor in Australia, and I follow him. His name is Reverend William Loader. These are his words. Elijah learns that God is found in the still small voice, not in the impressive special effects. More than, because of that, a more profound and personal relationship with God can develop when we are willing to listen intently. So, those are Reverend Loader's words. So, Royal Oak, beloved worshiping community on this fifth Sunday in Lent, how will God's still small voice speak to us going forward in our Lenten journey and going forward in a new spiritual practice of intentionally finding God in the silence? And as a beloved worshiping community, what can we do to create still, small, silent spaces where people can be invited in to discover God? I'm glad you asked. Our worship committee is having a meeting tomorrow night at 5:30. It's in the bulletin. It's here in the social hall. Bring a dinner, but you are all invited to come. In this silence, we want to hear your voices and your contributions of what we can do to bring more people into more profound relationships with God. You see, in silence, as Elijah discovered, God's still small voice rings in our ears, opens our hearts, and inspires our spirits. In silence, we can do what we talked about last week. Pray always, pray everywhere, and pray with everything. And so I want to close with a prayer. This prayer is Psalm 62, verse 1. For God alone my soul waits in silence. From him comes my salvation. So, beloved worshiping community, we give thanks and praise that God is present in all aspects of our lives, that God speaks to us in the dramatic, in the ordinary, and God works with us at every moment to make our lives extraordinary in his holiness and grace and forgiveness and redemption. In Jesus, amen.